This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. The doping controversy over world number one Jannik Sinner has divided the tennis world. In March 2024, Sinner tested positive for clostebol, a banned anabolic steroid. As per the rules of the International Tennis Integrity Agency or ITIA and the World Anti-Doping Code WADC, this would result in an automatic provisional suspension pending an appeal. Sinner, however, appealed the provisional suspension, and an independent hearing convened by the ITIA found that Sinner bore no fault or negligence for the positive tests. Subsequently, the World Anti-Doping Agency WADA appealed this ruling. WADA's appeal was supposed to have come up for hearing at the Court of Arbitration of Sport or CAS on April 16th and 17th this year. But now the WADA appeal will not be heard because Sinner and WADA have reached a case resolution agreement or a settlement, to put it plainly. And under this settlement, instead of the 1 to 2 year ban that WADA had wanted, Sinner will serve out a 3-month ban from February 9th to May 4th. This means he will not miss any Grand Slams despite a doping violation that has resulted in other tennis players serving out a ban of 1 to several years. Is tennis's anti-doping process broken, as several players have said now? Are there double standards in this process with top players benefiting while the lower ranked players don't get the same treatment or benefit of doubt? And how credible or transparent is a process where a player can quote unquote negotiate a settlement for a doping offense? We discuss all these questions and more in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us N. Sudarshan from the Hindu's Sports Bureau. Sudarshan, welcome to In Focus. So, Sudarshan, to start with, I was wondering, if you can give us a brief overview of the background to the case resolution agreement that Sinner has reached with WADA. I mean, apparently, the offense, the doping offense, is something which carries 1 to 2 years of a ban from tennis, but he has settled for 3 months. So, how do you reach this kind of a settlement? And what was the process? We can just take our listeners through that.
Let's first go to the background. The issue first came into public knowledge just before the 2024 US Open, when the International Tennis Integrity Agency announced that Sinner was guilty of 2 positive dope tests for the presence of the chemical clostebol. Now, at an independent hearing, Sinner was found to bear no fault or negligence, with the International Tennis Integrity Agency accepting his explanation that it was through a contaminated product, which is in this case a healing spray, which was purchased by his physio, and it came through his physiotherapist who was giving him a massage. So the reason that convinced the ITIA was that it was transdermal contamination. Now the 2 tests happened on March 10th and March 18th, 2024. The first one was at Indian Wells Masters, and the second one was an out-of-competition test. Now, once a player returns a positive test, the player is provisionally suspended, but he can immediately appeal the decision. Now, Sinner did, and the ITIA accepted the independent tribunal's decision that Sinner's explanation was credible. Now, the tribunal said it had consulted scientific experts. ITIA and the independent tribunal both concluded that Sinner did not intentionally dope. While Sinner continued to play, a full investigation was carried out by the ITIA and another independent tribunal appointed by an independent body called Sports Resolutions. Now, that tribunal also found that there was no fault or negligence on the part of Sinner. This was the ruling that came just before the US Open. A month after the US Open, the World Anti-Doping Agency appealed this ruling from the independent tribunal, saying there was no fault or negligence on the part of Sinner. So they were asking for a 1 to 2 year ban, and the case was supposed to be heard by the CAS on April 16th and 17th. Now that appeal will not be heard because there is now a settlement. Now, how does a player reach a settlement? The case resolution agreement is very much part of the WADA code. I can actually quote from the specific WADA code, where so a case resolution agreement is very much part of the WADA code, and it was actually introduced in 2021 when the last time the WADA code was formed and updated. And there have been past instances, like in volleyball in July 2023, the World Volleyball Association, FIVB, WADA, and a player called Dimitri Link agreed to one such thing. Now, the case resolution agreement, I can quote you in for a sample. Now, it just says that where the athlete or the other person admits an anti-doping rule violation after being confronted with the anti-doping rule violation by an agency, the anti-doping organization, in this case, the ITIA and WADA, at their sole discretion, can decide on the period of ineligibility based on an assessment by the organization. Now, it depends on how serious the violation is, the degree of fault, and how promptly the athlete or the other person admitted to the violation. And the period of ineligibility may start as early as the date of sample collection. Now, this case resolution agreement, they can enter into a case resolution agreement, and the amount of the reduction and the starting date and the period of ineligibility are not matters for determination or review by a hearing. So a resolution settlement is not new. It is part of the WADA code since 2021.
No, Sudarshan, if it has been introduced since 2021, what about cases of Tara Moore and Simona Halep and all, which keeps coming up, Elias Eimer? Are these cases all predating this 2021 case resolution kind of a provision, or did they happen afterwards? Are there any cases of tennis players who had to go through the gauntlet of 1 year, 2 years ban without immediate response to some kind of an appeal or whatever after 2021?
I think the Simona Halep case happened in sometime in 2022, if I am not wrong. So we can go through how the whole anti-doping procedure actually happens. Now, the rules are of ITIA are pretty clear, because once the dope is found in your body, the full details will be sent to the anti-doping review board without identifying the player. Now, an independent group will study and inform the ITIA if there is a case. The player will then receive the first pre-charge notice, and he or she will be given 2 weeks to explain. The player can choose to have their B sample tested, and Halep actually asked for her B sample to be tested. Now, if in that 2 weeks period, a player can apply for what is called TUE, the therapeutic use exemption, and the case is closed if it is found to be satisfactory. Now, if a non-specified substance is found in the body, even and the TUE explanation, if provided, is not satisfactory, the suspension is given provisionally. Now, a player can immediately appeal this to an independent tribunal, and for this they have 10 days. Now, if the appeal is successful, the player will be allowed to compete while a full-fledged investigation starts, which is what happened in Sinner's case. But in the case of Halep, she appealed, but the explanation was not found to be credible. So the player, at the end of that initial appeal against the provisional suspension, it was made public, and the case went on along with the independent tribunal for a full investigation. In case of Tara Moore, as per my understanding and from what I have read, she didn't appeal the initial provisional suspension that she received in the first 10 days. So that's why the case dragged on, and she had to be exonerated after a full 19 months from the date of the violation.
Right. I mean, it seems like many players are not really aware of this kind of, this provisional suspension getting appealed if you file that appeal within 10 days. In most of these cases, it does become public. In Sinner's case, it did not become public. And, today's news, Djokovic has, in a statement, has said that this case smacks of favoritism. Now, on this question, Sudarshan, I was just wondering, this whole case resolution clauses which you just read out, is there any kind of a guideline or a protocol or a formula by which these guys who are sitting in judgment, who are negotiating, they can reduce a 1 or 2 year punishment to 3 months? or is it purely discretionary? Because if it's discretionary, if it's subjective, then there is scope for arbitrariness and allegations of favoritism, isn't it? Or unless you say, okay, for this you can bring it to 3 months, for this you can reduce it to 6 months. Is that, like, how do you know how much to reduce it by when you reach a settlement or in your settlement negotiations?
So where you say it is subjective is very correct, because anti-doping is not a criminal offense. So it's more of a preventive code. So in all non-criminal cases, everything is decided on the balance of probabilities. So there are independent tribunals which sit in judgment as to whose explanation is more credible and who can prove certain things, at least to a point beyond reasonable doubt. Now, if you present the same set of facts to two or more tribunals, there is every chance that they can arrive at completely different judgments, which is what keeps happening in doping cases. Because even if you read out Simona Halep's cast judgment, there is the mention of balance of probabilities. The tribunal decided that 4 years was the ban based on balance of probabilities. The same set of facts were presented to CAS, and they also applied the same balance of probabilities test and decided that 4 months was too excessive, 4 years was too excessive, so we reduced it to 9 months. Now, what has happened in the Sinner thing is, now we can first list out the degrees of offense and the corresponding punishment that is meted out. If it was proved that it was intentional doping, it's 4 years, like you said. Now it drops to 2 if the player can prove that he or she did not intentionally dope. And if there is a finding of no fault or negligence on the part of a player, which is what happened with Sinner, there is a possibility of the punishment going straight to 0. Now, WADA said it accepted the athlete's explanation for the cause of violation as outlined in the first decision that was announced by the ITIA's Independent Tribunal, where there was a no fault or negligence this thing. WADA also accepted that Sinner did not intend to teach, and the exposure to clostebol did not provide him any performance enhancing benefit, and it took place without his knowledge as the result of negligence of the members of his entourage. Now, when you look at the case resolution, you do feel that Sinner agreeing to a ban does imply certain guilt. He did say that in his statement, where he mentioned that his entourage was his own responsibility. But looking at the macro picture, I feel both sides were wary of an unfavorable outcome. Sinner didn't want this to go on for another year. There is a good chance that CAS may not have immediately ruled on it and would have maybe taken another 3 months, 4 months. Past precedents does state that there have been cases where CAS has taken more than 3 to 4 months after the hearing to pronounce its decision. And the WADA also did not want to lose. Now, if that had happened, it would have set a precedent where every player can somehow convince that the doping was unintentional and they can go scot-free. But like you said, they were sitting and negotiating, but there was no clarity on who moved first. Now, one bit that is extremely interesting here is WADA is going to introduce a new code in 2027, and there are still deliberations on those part. But there are 2 new distinctions that have been introduced there. Number one is whether the violation is reckless as opposed to intentional. Second one is whether the athlete can establish how the prohibited substance entered their system. Now, if an athlete can establish how the substance entered the system, the focus is next on the source of that substance, which is generally called the contaminated product. Currently, the contaminated product has a very narrow definition. It says a product that contains a prohibited substance that is not disclosed on the label of the product or information available in a reasonable internet search. WADA has felt that this is very narrow and does not consider other source of contamination, like food might be contaminated. There might be environmental ways of contamination. So there is a new contamination source definition that is a bit broader, and it includes food, drink, environmental reasons, etc. But it also includes exposure through contact with a third person or object touched by third person. Now, let us put this reasoning to the Sinner case. Now, if the Sinner case had happened after the new WADA code was introduced in 2027, and the exposure was deemed to be through a contact with a third person, which in this case are the 2 physios of Sinner, or an object touched by the third person, which the object in Sinner's case is the spray, there's a good chance that Sinner would have got not even 3 months. So this is how it's going to go. And in 2077, if it had happened, there's a good chance that Sinner might not have been banned for 3 months also.
Right. So, Sudarshan, this you mentioned something about whether the product the product contains a labeling. The product used by the player has a mention of the bland substance on the label. This trifoderfin, what is it? Spray he used, trofodermin or something like that, right?
Yes.
And it states very clearly on the labeling of the product that it contains clostebol, and clostebol is mentioned as a non-specified substance, which you can't really have. So, and this fitness coach, Umberto Ferrara, he has bought it, and he has signed a contract with Sinner that you'll be responsible to ensure that he maintains the highest levels of care, etc., so that there is no doping violation. Such a person goes and buys a spray on whose container it is the label has clostebol mentioned. Then how do you then conclude that Sinner bears no fault or responsibility? I mean, clearly there is a fault of negligence here, right?
Yes, there is a clear fault of negligence, and that is what Sinner accepted when he agreed to the case resolution agreement, that he bore full responsibility for his entourage, and that is what WADA also wanted, and they agreed to the 3 months. Maybe my understanding is they feared that it could not have been 3 months also. Now, how did they decide? Again, this is where the balance of probabilities and the credibility of the evidence or the arguments that the two parties put forth comes into picture. Now, the independent tribunal based its findings on how Sinner explained his case. Now, Ferreira had receipts of the spray that were bought. There is actually a full account of how Naldi cut his finger and Ferreira advised Naldi to use that spray in the case ruling. But there is also these mention that there are some discrepancies as to whether Ferreira advised Naldi about the anti-doping thing. Naldi said he had no knowledge of the spray containing clostebol. Sinner also said that he did not know Ferreira had the spray and Naldi used it. It was also confirmed that Sinner had a condition called psoriasiform dermatitis, and as a result of which his skin is itchy, leads to scratching, and can cause small cuts and sores. The player was interviewed twice, and it was confirmed by the tribunal that he didn't know that Ferreira had the spray. He didn't know it had a prohibited substance, and that Naldi used it. 3 scientific experts confirmed the inadvertent contamination. So this is basically it. And all of this was decided on the balance of probability. The player's testimony was taken, limited documentary evidence.
No, Sudarshan, on this question of balance of probabilities, I mean, these are all Ferrara and Naldi. They come from the whole fitness coaching ecosystem of Italy, and Italy has had a history of players not just from tennis but also from basketball and football. Where there have been instances of players found to be in doping violation, and specifically with clostebol. And other players have used the same justification of the spray cream sort of getting transdermal contamination and so on. It's happened before. I mean, the balance of probability would assume that neither of these guys, Ferrara or Naldi, were aware of this entire scenario of Italy having this excessive number of players getting caught with this clostebol in their system.
I think the onus is on Sinner, and since the tribunal was convinced that Sinner didn't know that the spray was used by Naldi, and it was handed over to Naldi by Ferreira, I think the presence of 2 third parties is what has sort of exonerated Sinner to a certain extent. But since he doesn't, and since it cannot be a full exoneration, like you said, since there is a certain responsibility of the player to ensure that no banned substance enters his body in whichever way. And that is why I think he has been given 3 months and not just 0.
Right. I think the fact there are 2 third parties involved, I suppose, may have helped Sinner. I mean, I think even so, I think this would require a tribunal or a tribunal of experts who might be sort of sympathetically disposed, let us say, because someone like, if you've been following Nick Kyrgios's tweets and posts on this, I mean, it's clearly he's coming from the other side. He's like the side of skepticism. So either you start from a position of skepticism or from a position of sympathy. A presumption of innocence, I suppose, is how it is done. Now, moving on to a slightly different aspect of the independent tribunal also has made the distinction between a positive doping outcome and performance enhancement. And it has argued that the amounts found in Sinner's system could not really have enhanced performance. I mean, I'm just wondering, is this really relevant at all? Because how do you make this distinction about? Because they also use things. There are ways of reducing how much of it shows up in your urine samples, blood samples. People use diuretics to sort of get the thing out of the system. So you may have a situation where very little of the non-specified substance is found in your blood in the test, but you may have used a lot of it, and a lot of it has been sort of erased from your system. So I'm just curious: is this distinction made in other sports as well, between a positive test, automatically assumed to be evidence of intent to cheat, versus positive test not really leading to enhanced performance kind of a situation?
I'm not very sure about other sports, but as far as I have read, the WADA code of 2021, there is something called a decision limit. Under Article 2, it actually says that excepting those substances for which a decision limit is specifically identified in the prohibited list or a technical document, the presence of any reported quantity of a prohibited substance or its markers shall constitute an anti-doping violation. Now, there is a certain limit, and I don't know if it exists for clostebol. But like you said, it's also a bit perplexing to me that both the ITIA spoke about the amounts found in Sinner's body having no effect on his performance enhancement, and WADA repeating it in its case resolution agreement. Because I don't think the success or a failure of a doping matters. It's just the intention that matters. Because the Article 2 of the WADA code is pretty clear on this. The success or failure of the use or attempted use of a prohibited substance or prohibited method is not material. It is sufficient that the prohibited substance or prohibited method was used or attempted to be used for an anti doping violation to be committed. So I do feel that this conclusion or this argument to further the case stands out. But overall, I feel it was only used as an hypothetical argument, because if his doping was proved intentional, I don't think whether it improved his performance or didn't improve his performance would have even mattered. They have introduced this as a way of buttressing their logic, which seems very weird, just because they were convinced that it was non-intentional.
Yeah, I mean, once you have established that Sinner did not, there was no intention to cheat, and therefore he's innocent. Now, then you move on to the fact that he has got like two positive doping test outcomes. And once that is there, I mean, getting into whether it enhanced his performance or not, yeah, as you said, it is quite perplexing. Now, moving on to the, this other aspect, I think the key to the entire Sinner case resolution agreement was this phrase of no fault or responsibility, for this entire positive outcome. So the Sinner himself has been exonerated, and these two physios, fitness coach and physio, have been held sort of responsible for the clostebol being found in his system. Now, okay, let's say Sinner does not deserve any consequences, but what about the two guys who were indeed responsible for those positive doping tests? Umberto Ferrara is now coaching Matteo Berrettini. He's still part of the ATP circuit. How come there is no material consequence for those guys who are part of the tour and who are actually responsible for this entire saga?
It does seem a bit not right, but in tennis, the player bears the full responsibility. Now, Sinner gets penalized, and he has been penalized in this case for 3 months. Now, if Umberto Ferreira is being employed by Berrettini, it's against Berrettini's responsibility. I think in tennis, they try to pin everything as the player's fault. This happened in Simona Halep's case as well, though it was proved to a certain extent that somebody had handed over her the contaminated product. I don't think they charge the person responsible. If there is a very light analogy that I can draw, a non-doping analogy. We can go back to Serena Williams' on-court case in the 2018 US Open final against Osaka. Serena clearly said that she didn't receive on-court coaching. But Patrick Murtaglu, her coach, did confirm to the New York Times that he gave instructions, which is also what Ramos, the chair umpire, said. But in the end, it was Serena who bore the penalty and the coach went scot-free. It does seem very incongruous, but I feel that tennis authorities feel it's easier to discipline the players rather than 1, 2, 3 physios who are not necessarily registered with the tours per se, but but are on contract basis with the players. They can hire and fire them anytime.
So there is no provision by which the physios or the fitness coach or the coach can be penalized for a doping violation if they are found responsible.
So far, I have not seen anything happen like that. Maybe in future they may consider this, like how in athletics, the coaches, there is now a move to penalize the coaches as well.
I mean, that's very strange, because if you take the case of Rybakina's coach Stefano Vukov, he was banned from the Australian Open by the WTA for abusive behavior. Now WTA can ban him for abusive behavior, and there is nobody who can ban someone like Humberto Ferreira for spiking his doping, not spiking, let us say, for being irresponsible enough to land Sinner, the world number one player, in this kind of a trouble.
Yeah, it does feel a bit incongruous, correct? Like if you can police a coach, you can always police a physio. That's right, yeah.
Sudarshan, now looking at the players' reaction, which is the one huge part of this unfolding story, Kyrgios has been tweeting, Djokovic has given his statement today, and one player who sort of immediately reacted was three-time Grand Slam winner Stan Wawrinka, who tweeted, saying that he doesn't believe in a clean sport anymore. That's a strong reaction. Do you think it was justified? Was he sort of reflecting a sentiment that is perhaps widespread among the men's tour, or do you think it's an overreaction? Like, what are your thoughts on this?
I would take the middle path here. I can certainly understand the angst of many players, but when they actually step back and see that, I feel the players have to sort of come to an agreement that the facts in each case, the set of circumstances, the evidence and the resolution are all bespoke. It matters from case to case. The same clostebol violation can be decided in many different ways depending on the particular case at hand. But that said, there is certainly space for reform. Now, let us wind back a bit. The first thing, as soon as the provisional suspension is announced, what happens is there's a 10-day period to appeal. When the appeal is verified, the players remain suspended. And that's the small price they have to pay, but it will not be made public. Now, that provisional suspension will be removed if the chair is satisfied. Now, in Sinner's case, the first time it happened for 2 days, and the second time it happened for 3 days for the 2 positive tests. And Swiatek missed 3 tournaments provisionally suspended. So all the initial action, if you see, is happening in those 10 days. And that's where tennis authorities and players have to focus. In the 10-day period, every player should be guaranteed solid legal help. And without a players' union, this will not happen. I think the PTPA was actually very right when they, even much before this case, when they said solid legal help is one of the basic requirements for a player. Now, Sinner could mount a stupendous defense in a day. It was also aided by his case details, no doubt. He was able to mount 2 defenses to convince an independent chair that he bore no fault. But it shouldn't be the case that a lower rank player is not able to muster that legal help in those 10 days and he just cannot appeal, though he may be right in what he has done and has done nothing wrong. This is something that has to be addressed. Actually, you can actually see something that may happen in India. Now, everybody can say that the Supreme Court of India is open to every citizen of the country, which is a fact. But how many of us can get our cases heard if we don't know a 5-star lawyer there? Now, I'll come to the players saying the sport is not fair anymore. It's certainly does feel so in this doping thing because of the legal help that star players can get. But I feel the players should also be focusing on more sinister things that are happening in tennis on a day-to-day basis, because anti-doping violations, those serious, are few and far between. You may not have those many cases in a year. But one of the most egregious things that has happened in tennis recently, where the sport is just not fair, is having on-court coaching. Now, you cannot have a world number 100 having nobody in his corner and the world number 1 having Andy Murray in his corner. Novak Djokovic having Andy Murray in his corner. That is disproportionately incentivizing one player just because he has the financial muscle to be where he is. The use of roofs when it cannot be guaranteed to every player. The unilateral changes to tournament structures like what the US Open is doing, wanting singles players to play doubles. Now, how much more money does the singles player want? The doubles money is already low, and you are further disincentivizing players. So I feel tennis as a sport is unequal. They are just doing everything possible to make it more unequal. Doping is certainly, anti-doping certainly needs reform, but more immediate are these other reforms which also have to take place. And players, I feel, should be at the forefront of driving this.
Right. I mean, that is very well put, Sudarshan. Of course, doping is a serious issue, even though it doesn't sort of hit us so frequently. But the other issues you pointed out, maybe we should sort of get talking, maybe devote one episode to each of those at some point. On-court coaching is, of course, a very important issue which sort of really queers the pitch. I mean, already, there is a huge mismatch in terms of, a level playing field, so to speak, between a number one or a top 20 player and somebody who's come through 3 rounds of qualifying and then faces Djokovic in first round, who has Andy Murray sitting in his corner and he's already exhausted, having played maybe 2 or 3 sitters, and then he's got nobody in his corner, and it further makes it, loads the dice against the quote unquote arm admi of tennis and in favor of the celebrity and star players. And similarly for the singles and the mixed doubles changes in the US Open. And then you made one point about the roof, is it?
Yes, because so you can always say that a top player playing under roof is justified because he's there because of his ranking. Now, the world number 1 draws, say, somebody who's world number 90. The world number 90 is not playing on Orthodox Stadium under roof because of his merit. Now, the world number 91 can draw somebody as world number 50 and be pushed to the outside court. And if there is a rain, world number 100, just because he's playing against Djokovic, can get through his match and go to the next tournament, or if he wants to go and play in doubles, his schedule is not disrupted. But a player of a similar rank, just because he drew somebody else, got shunted to the outside court and has to play 2 matches in the same day. So I feel until, say, at least the quarterfinals, when every player is guaranteed roof, it does make it a very unequal field if you start playing with roof during rainy days in the first week of the tournament.
So would you say that nobody should be, the roof should not come into play at all until the quarterfinals, even when it rains?
Ideally, I would feel that that's what makes it a very fair playing field.
Right, that's an interesting idea. I never thought about that level. Maybe, I don't know. I wonder what will happen to Wimbledon if this was imposed. That it rains almost, I think, every day, right?
Yeah.
Great. Anyway, let's hope that the points you made about in terms of reforming the anti-doping regime, bringing more of legal help to players across the board, across rankings, and also bringing more focus on this provisional suspension period, which sometimes can drag on and bring a lot of adverse publicity even when players are innocent. I think these are 2 key points here. And thank you so much for those observations and really insightful explanations, taking the listeners through this sort of rather tedious process that is anti-doping regime. And that's all I have for you in this episode. Sudarshan, thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much, Sampak, for having me. It was a pleasure being here.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.